Jennifer Wilbanks seemed to have it all. At 32 years old, she was living a comfortable life in Duluth, Georgia, a charming suburban town just outside of Atlanta. She had a stable job, a loving family, and most notably, a fiancé who adored her. John Mason, a successful businessman from a well-respected family, was the picture of a devoted partner. Their relationship had progressed quickly, but to those who knew them, it seemed like a fairy tale romance leading up to an extravagant wedding. The wedding itself was nothing short of a spectacle, a 600-guest affair meticulously planned with the finest details. The venue was one of the most sought after in the state. Floral arrangements had been chosen, the dress was custom made, and an elaborate rehearsal dinner was scheduled. Every detail had been carefully crafted to create the perfect day. To everyone on the outside, Jennifer should have been the happiest woman in the world. But behind the smiles and wedding preparations, something was off. Her closest friends would later recall that Jennifer had been showing signs of stress, intense anxiety, mood swings, and moments of emotional breakdowns. She was struggling to keep up with the overwhelming expectations of the wedding. As the big day drew closer, Jennifer seemed increasingly distant. Her bridal party noticed how she became quieter, lost in thought, as if trapped in a place she couldn't escape from. But no one, not even John, suspected just how deeply she was struggling or what she was about to do. April 26, 2005 started as any other day. Jennifer went about her usual routine, running errands, making last-minute wedding arrangements, and exchanging texts with friends and family. That evening, she laced up her running shoes and set out for a jog, something she did often to clear her mind. But this time, she never came back. As the hours stretched on, John grew concerned. Jennifer was supposed to return home in time to help finalize some wedding details, but when he called her phone, it rang unanswered. At first, he assumed she had been delayed, maybe stopped to chat with someone or lost track of time. But as night fell, the unease turned into full-blown panic. By morning, John called Jennifer's family. No one had heard from her. That's when the police were notified. Authorities wasted no time launching the search. Jennifer's jogging route was well known, so officers and volunteers scoured the trails and streets of Duluth, hoping to find any trace of her. Flyers were printed and distributed. Her face was everywhere on the news, in newspapers, and across social media. But the search quickly took on a more ominous tone. There was no sign of Jennifer, no witnesses, no surveillance footage that showed where she had gone. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. As the hours stretched into days, theories began to emerge. Had she been kidnapped, attacked? Did someone close to her know more than they were letting on? And then came the whispers, dark suspicions that no one wanted to say out loud. What if Jennifer was no longer alive? What if they weren't searching for a missing bride, but for something much worse? The wedding of the year had suddenly turned into a full-blown crisis. Just days earlier, Jennifer Wilbanks had been preparing to walk down the aisle, surrounded by hundreds of guests, draped in white lace and gold embellishments. But now, the conversations that should have been about floral arrangements and wedding vows had shifted to desperate phone calls and frantic speculation. John Mason was in shock. One moment, he was finalizing details for their dream wedding, and the next, his fiancée was gone without a trace. His once joyful anticipation had morphed into sheer panic. Had something happened to Jennifer? Had she been taken? The thought that she may have been harmed gnawed at him with every passing minute. The Wilbanks family, equally distraught, leaned on law enforcement to provide answers, but none were coming. With each hour that passed, the reality of Jennifer's disappearance became grimmer. The press was beginning to take notice, and soon the town of Duluth found itself at the center of a rapidly unfolding media storm. Jennifer was last seen jogging, an activity that should have been safe routine, but in that instant she had disappeared off the face of the earth. Authorities had no immediate evidence of foul play, but the circumstances were too bizarre to ignore. Had she been abducted? Did she have cold feet and simply run away? Or was something far more sinister at play? The days leading up to what should have been the happiest moment of Jennifer's life were now overshadowed by an agonizing question: where was she? The search for Jennifer Wilbanks was unlike anything the small town of Duluth had ever seen. Within hours of her reported disappearance, local police mobilized teams to scour the areas surrounding her usual jogging route. It wasn't long before the FBI stepped in, adding manpower and resources to the growing investigation. Flyers with Jennifer's photo were printed and distributed across the state. Her face flooded the evening news, accompanied by urgent pleas from her family and fiancé begging for any information. Volunteers formed search parties combing through wooded trails, rivers, and highways. Authorities brought in cadaver dogs, searching for any scent of Jennifer. Helicopters scanned from above, their spotlights piercing the night. But despite the relentless efforts, there was no trace of her, no footprints, no discarded belongings, no security footage that hinted at her last movements. The lack of clues was unsettling. Usually, when someone disappears, investigators find something: an abandoned car, a piece of clothing, a witness who remembers seeing them last. But with Jennifer, there was nothing. Theories started swirling. Some believed she had been kidnapped by a stranger, taken against her will. Others weren't so sure. What if Jennifer had run away? Was she having second thoughts about her wedding? Still, no one wanted to believe that she would simply vanish like this. The pressure mounted, and so did the fear. The longer Jennifer remained missing, the higher the chances were that she wasn't coming back. It didn't take long for Jennifer Wilbanks' disappearance to become national news. The moment the story broke, the media latched onto it with an almost obsessive grip. A beautiful bride days away from saying, "I do," vanishing without a trace, it was the kind of mystery that captivated the public's imagination. News crews flooded Duluth, setting up outside Jennifer's family home, near the Mason residence, and even at the church where the wedding was supposed to take place. Reporters speculated on live television, each one eager to be the first to break a new development. Was this a tragic case of abduction? Had Jennifer been a victim of foul play? Or an idea few wanted to say out loud: had she run away? Talk shows ran dramatic segments about the Runaway Bride theory, dissecting Jennifer's background, her relationship with John Mason, and the pressures of a high-profile wedding. Psychologists and crime analysts weighed in. Some said stress might have caused her to flee. Others pointed to something darker, perhaps a crime of passion, a scorned lover, or even a secret life Jennifer had kept hidden. As the media frenzy grew, so did the public's curiosity. Across the country, people tuned in, waiting for updates. Was Jennifer alive? Had someone taken her? Would this case end in tragedy or in an even bigger twist? For Jennifer's family and John Mason, the sudden explosion of media attention was overwhelming. It was no longer just a private search. It was a nationwide spectacle. And with the cameras rolling, another unsettling reality began to emerge. When a woman disappears, the first place authorities look is the man closest to her. As the search stretched into its second day, police turned their attention to the man who had the most to lose: John Mason. It's an unfortunate truth in many missing person cases. The spouse, fiancé, or boyfriend is always the first suspect. Statistically, when a woman vanishes, the person closest to her is often involved. Investigators knew that, and John knew it too. The questioning began almost immediately. Detectives sat him down and went through every detail of Jennifer's last known moments. Had they argued? Had she been unhappy? Was there a history of violence? At first, John was cooperative, answering every question, providing alibis, even allowing investigators to search his home. But suspicion was hard to shake. From the outside, John appeared calm, too calm, some thought. His lack of visible distress made some wonder if he knew more than he was saying. Reporters scrutinized his every movement. Armchair detectives speculated online, analyzing his mannerisms in interviews, his choice of words, even his body language. Was he hiding something? Was he the reason Jennifer had vanished? Adding to the unease, police had no evidence of foul play, no sign of a struggle, no leads pointing to an abduction. It was as if Jennifer had simply ceased to exist, and in cases like that, the fiancé, no matter how innocent, remained the prime suspect. John insisted that he had nothing to do with Jennifer's disappearance. He swore he loved her, that they had been happy, that he was just as desperate to find her as anyone else. But until investigators found Jennifer dead or alive, John Mason was going to remain under an unforgiving microscope. And the pressure was about to get worse, because just when it seemed like Jennifer was gone forever, something unexpected happened. She called 911. With every hour that passed, the possibility that Jennifer had met a terrible fate became harder to ignore. The town of Duluth, once buzzing with anticipation for what should have been a grand wedding, now sat under a cloud of unease. The community, gripped by fear, whispered about what might have happened to Jennifer. People locked their doors a little earlier. Women who jogged the same paths she did so in pairs or not at all. Law enforcement ramped up their investigation. The local police, already stretched thin, requested assistance from the FBI, who quickly began looking into the possibility of an abduction. Their first step was to comb through the registry of sex offenders and known criminals in the area. Was it possible that Jennifer had been snatched off the street by a predator? The FBI also analyzed her financial records. Had she accessed her bank account, withdrawn cash, used a credit card? If Jennifer had left voluntarily, there would be a paper trail. But there wasn't. Her accounts were untouched. That alone was alarming. As authorities expanded their efforts, so did the media. The story of the missing bride to be spread across the country. News networks ran updates by the hour. Missing person posters with Jennifer's smiling face, her bright blue eyes, her neatly styled brown hair were tacked onto telephone poles, shop windows, and gas stations. But despite the national attention, there were no major leads, no security footage of Jennifer leaving town, no witnesses stepping forward. It was as if she had been erased. And then came the hardest part of all the waiting, because the longer someone is missing, the lower the chances of finding them alive. It had now been 3 days since Jennifer Wilbanks left for her evening jog and never came back. Then, out of nowhere, a phone call changed everything. It was April 29th, 3 days after Jennifer Wilbanks disappeared. At a 911 dispatch center in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a call came in. The voice on the other end was trembling. It was Jennifer. "I've been kidnapped," she gasped. She told the dispatcher she had been abducted by two people, a Hispanic man and a white woman who had held her against her will. Her story was terrifying. They had driven her across multiple states. They had blindfolded her. They had threatened her life. She sounded scared, desperate. And then the line went dead. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then chaos. Authorities in Albuquerque immediately dispatched officers to the payphone's location. They braced for the worst. If Jennifer had truly been kidnapped and managed to escape, she might still be in grave danger. The country had been watching this case unfold for days, fearing that Jennifer was dead. Now she was alive but trapped in a nightmare that was still unfolding. The only question was, would her story hold up? When officers arrived at the payphone in Albuquerque, they found Jennifer Wilbanks standing alone. Her clothes were disheveled, her hair slightly unkempt, and she looked exhausted. But aside from being visibly shaken, she was unharmed. She was immediately taken to a nearby police station where detectives sat her down to get her statement. What she described was nothing short of horrifying. According to Jennifer, she had been abducted at gunpoint while jogging in Duluth. The kidnappers, a Hispanic man and a white woman, had forced her into a vehicle, blindfolded her, and driven her across multiple states. She claimed they had assaulted her, threatened her, and eventually decided to release her in Albuquerque, thousands of miles from home. It was the nightmare scenario investigators had feared: a brutal abduction, a young woman held against her will, and a horrifying ordeal at the hands of two strangers. But something about Jennifer's story wasn't sitting right. The detectives listening to her account had handled enough cases to know when something didn't add up, and as she spoke, red flags started appearing. For one, Jennifer's physical condition didn't match the horror she was describing. Despite claiming to have been blindfolded, restrained, and assaulted, she had no visible injuries, no bruises, no rope burns, no signs of trauma. Her clothes, though slightly wrinkled, were intact. She looked more like someone who had been on a long trip rather than someone who had just endured a violent ordeal. And then there was her demeanor. Yes, she was shaken, but not in the way most kidnapping victims are. There was something rehearsed about the way she told her story, something a little too careful in her details. Still, detectives continued their questioning, but the more they pressed, the more the inconsistencies began to show. At first, Jennifer stuck to her story. She described how her captors had forced her into a van, how she had been terrified for her life, and how she had miraculously been set free in New Mexico. But as detectives dug deeper, the cracks in her version of events widened. The first problem: her timeline. Jennifer couldn't clearly account for the 3 days she had been missing. When asked where she had been kept, she gave vague, conflicting answers. When pressed on what her captors had said to her, she stammered. And when detectives asked about how she had escaped, her story changed multiple times. Then came the forensic inconsistencies. Detectives expected to find physical evidence supporting her claims: marks on her wrists, signs of restraint, even dirt on her clothing from being held in unknown locations. But there was nothing. Her body bore no indication of struggle, and her clothing showed no signs of force. And then there was the glaring question: if her kidnappers had truly held her captive for days, why had they just let her go? Why release a witness who could easily describe them to the police? Something wasn't right. As the detectives continued to push, Jennifer's confidence began to waver. Her responses became shorter, less detailed. She seemed exhausted, as if struggling to keep track of her own fabrications. And then the breaking point came. With nowhere left to turn, Jennifer took a deep breath, looked at the detectives sitting across from her, and said something that would turn the entire case upside down. She had lied. The interrogation room fell silent as Jennifer Wilbanks hesitated. Her shoulders slumped. Her breathing grew unsteady. The weight of her own story was crushing her, and she could no longer keep up the act. Then, with a deep sigh, she finally said the words investigators had suspected all along. It was all a lie. There had been no abduction, no masked kidnappers, no assault. She had run away. The officers exchanged glances. They had spent days believing they were chasing down dangerous criminals, kidnappers who had snatched a woman off the streets. And now, with one confession, the case had completely unraveled. Jennifer admitted she had boarded a Greyhound bus in Georgia and traveled to Las Vegas before eventually ending up in Albuquerque. She had wandered around alone, deliberately avoiding news reports or anything that would make her second guess her decision. When she realized how big the search for her had become, she panicked. That's when she made the 911 call, fabricating the story about the kidnappers in a last-ditch effort to explain her absence. Her tearful confession left investigators stunned. A nationwide manhunt, thousands of volunteer hours, and an entire country gripped by fear, all for nothing. And yet, one question remained unanswered. Why? Why would a woman with a seemingly perfect life, days away from marrying a man who adored her, run away like this? When detectives asked Jennifer why she had staged her own disappearance, her answer was surprisingly simple. She had been overwhelmed. The wedding, the planning, the expectations, it had all become too much. The pressure to be the perfect bride, to go through with a marriage she wasn't sure she was ready for, had consumed her. And so she ran. It wasn't just the stress of the wedding itself, it was the idea of commitment, of stepping into a new life that she wasn't completely certain about. Maybe she loved John, maybe she didn't. But one thing was clear, she wasn't ready to walk down the aisle in front of 600 people and promise forever. Instead of talking to her fiancé, instead of calling off the wedding like any rational person would, Jennifer made the impulsive decision to flee without telling a soul. But running away wasn't enough. She knew that simply disappearing would lead to questions, suspicion, even anger. So she created a narrative that would shift the focus from herself to an external threat: kidnappers, danger, victimhood. It was a desperate act, but one that spiraled far beyond what she had ever anticipated. Now, sitting in a police station thousands of miles from home, Jennifer was no longer a missing person. She was no longer a victim. She was something else entirely. A liar. And the consequences of her actions were just beginning. The moment Jennifer Wilbanks' confession was made public, the media's tone shifted almost overnight. Just days earlier, she had been the nation's sweetheart, the tragic bride-to-be who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Now she was a punchline. News anchors who had once pleaded for her safe return now mocked her. The tabloids branded her the runaway bride. Late-night talk show hosts turned her story into comedy gold. Sketches and satirical cartoons ridiculed her, portraying her as a woman sprinting away from the altar in a wedding dress. But it wasn't just the media that was furious. The people who had spent hours, days, and nights searching for Jennifer, risking their own safety, sacrificing their time, felt betrayed. Volunteers who had combed the forests and trails, believing they were searching for a woman in danger, were livid. The city of Duluth, which had rallied around Jennifer's family, was left humiliated. Businesses had donated money for search efforts. Authorities had dedicated resources and manpower. Strangers had prayed, cried, and hoped for her safe return, and now they realized it had all been for nothing. For John Mason's, Jennifer's fiancé, the betrayal cut the deepest. He had publicly defended her, endured scrutiny from police, and prepared to marry her only to learn she had run away and lied to the entire world. In a statement to the press, John tried to remain composed, but behind the scenes he was humiliated. He had loved Jennifer. He had planned a life with her. And she had not only left him, she had staged a national crisis in the process. The damage was done. Jennifer Wilbanks wasn't missing. She wasn't kidnapped. She was infamous. And soon, her troubles would go beyond just public humiliation. If Jennifer thought a simple apology would be enough to move on from her deception, she was wrong. Law enforcement officials, already stretched thin from the nationwide search, were furious. The FBI, state police, and local authorities had poured countless hours and resources into finding her. They had treated her case like a high-priority abduction, only to find out she had willingly left town. Jennifer was quickly charged with making a false police report a serious offense, especially given the scale of the investigation. Prosecutors initially considered jail time. After all, she had wasted thousands of taxpayer dollars, taken law enforcement away from real emergencies, and caused widespread panic. But ultimately, she was offered a plea deal. Jennifer pleaded guilty to falsely reporting a crime, agreeing to 2 years of probation, 120 hours of community service, a fine of over $2,000 to cover some of the expenses from the investigation. Though she avoided jail, the punishment wasn't just legal, it was social. She had become one of the most infamous liars in America. Wherever she went, people whispered. Employers hesitated to hire her. She was no longer just Jennifer Wilbanks, she was the runaway bride. And as the dust settled, one question remained: could she ever truly rebuild her life? For John Mason, the humiliation was unbearable. Days earlier, he had been pleading for Jennifer's safe return, standing in front of cameras, desperate for any sign of the woman he loved. He had endured police scrutiny, fielded whispered accusations, and defended her against the growing suspicions that something wasn't right. And now he was left picking up the pieces of a relationship that had been shattered beyond repair. Jennifer hadn't just betrayed him, she had deceived the entire world. She had let him believe she was in danger. She had let his family and friends suffer, imagining the worst. And worst of all, she had let him prepare for a wedding that, deep down, she knew she would never go through with. For weeks after her return, John struggled with what to do. He had loved Jennifer. He had envisioned a future with her. But how do you marry someone who is capable of something like this? The couple attempted to move forward. Jennifer apologized, insisting she had never meant to hurt him. She promised she had just panicked under the weight of expectations. But trust, once broken on such a massive scale, is almost impossible to rebuild. Slowly, the cracks widened. The once fairy tale romance now felt like a cautionary tale. By the following year, John Mason made a decision, one that most had seen coming. He ended the relationship. Jennifer Wilbanks would never be his bride. And John, he would eventually move on, meet someone new, and quietly build the life he had once imagined with someone else. If Jennifer Wilbanks thought she could quietly fade into the background after her confession, she was mistaken. The backlash was relentless. The same media that had once begged for information about her disappearance now turned on her with a vengeance. Every major news outlet ran the story of the runaway bride, dissecting her lies in excruciating detail. Late-night talk show hosts had a field day. David Letterman, Jay Leno, and countless comedians mocked her in their monologues. Saturday Night Live ran a skit portraying her as a woman sprinting away in a wedding dress, dodging responsibility like an Olympic athlete. But it wasn't just the media. Ordinary people, the ones who had prayed for her safe return, felt betrayed. Volunteers who had searched tirelessly for her were furious. Some had put their jobs on hold, taken time off work, and left their families behind to help. And for what? A hoax? Law enforcement officials, already stretched thin, saw Jennifer as a symbol of wasted resources. Officers who could have been solving real crimes had spent days tracking down a woman who had never been in danger at all. And the public, fed up with sensationalized hoaxes and false claims, had no sympathy. Jennifer Wilbanks had gone from beloved missing person to manipulative fraud in a matter of days. She would forever be known not as the woman who survived a tragedy, but as the woman who faked one. And as the ridicule grew louder, one thing became painfully clear. Jennifer Wilbanks had not only destroyed her own reputation, she had become one of the most infamous runaway brides in history. As the dust settled, a different conversation emerged, one that went beyond the lies, the humiliation, and the media circus. Why did Jennifer Wilbanks do it? Was she simply a runaway bride who got cold feet? Or was there something deeper, an underlying psychological issue that made her concoct such an elaborate and destructive escape plan? Many experts weighed in. Some believed Jennifer had suffered from severe anxiety or a dissociative episode, triggered by the overwhelming expectations of her wedding. Others speculated about undiagnosed mental health conditions, such as a panic disorder or even a personality disorder, that might explain her erratic behavior. Psychologists pointed to the flight response, a primal reaction to extreme stress. When some people feel trapped, their instincts push them to escape no matter the consequences. Jennifer, in that moment, might have felt like her only way out was to disappear completely. But there was one detail that troubled even the most understanding experts. Running away was one thing, but why lie? Why fabricate a kidnapping? Why send law enforcement and an entire nation into a panic? That's where opinions diverged. Some saw it as an impulsive mistake. Jennifer had run away, realized how much trouble she was in, and created a false story to cover her tracks. But others believed it showed something more calculated. The decision to invent kidnappers, complete with racial descriptions, suggested an intent to mislead, a move that went beyond simple panic. Had she truly lost control, or was she just a liar who wanted an easy way out? Even today, there's no clear answer. Jennifer Wilbanks never publicly admitted to any deeper psychological issues. She apologized, served her probation, and disappeared from the public eye. But the questions remained. What if she had never been caught? Would she have come back on her own? And if the wedding had never been so massive, if the pressure had been lower, would she have gone through with it? Or was Jennifer Wilbanks always destined to run? Beyond Jennifer Wilbanks herself, her case sparked a much larger discussion, one that many had been avoiding for years. What is it about weddings that pushes some people to the brink? Jennifer's story, extreme as it was, highlighted the immense pressure placed on women to have the perfect wedding. The extravagant ceremonies, the expectations, the weight of family traditions, it could all become suffocating. Some brides spent months or even years planning every last detail, every flower arrangement, every dress fitting, every guest list revision adds another layer of stress. And then there's the emotional side of it. A wedding isn't just a party, it's a life-altering decision. Marriage means forever, and for someone who isn't completely sure, the pressure can feel like a prison. Jennifer Wilbanks might have been an outlier, but her case forced people to ask uncomfortable questions. How many brides out there feel trapped, but go through with their weddings anyway? How many women suffer silently under the weight of family and societal expectations, afraid to admit they're not ready? And the most unsettling question of all, if Jennifer had spoken up, if she had simply told her family and fiancé that she wasn't ready, would anyone have listened? Maybe Jennifer Wilbanks wasn't just a runaway bride. Maybe she was a symbol of a bigger problem that no one wanted to talk about. After serving her probation, Jennifer Wilbanks did what many disgraced public figures attempt. She vanished from the spotlight. The world moved on. Other scandals took over the headlines, but for those who had invested themselves in her case, the police officers, the search volunteers, her devastated fiancé Jennifer's deception wasn't so easily forgotten. She and John Mason never reconciled. The wedding that had once been planned for 600 guests never happened. Instead, John quietly rebuilt his life, eventually marrying another woman and leaving the humiliation of the past behind him. Jennifer, on the other hand, struggled to outrun her own infamy. For years, the name Jennifer Wilbanks was synonymous with deceit. Even after completing her legal obligations, she remained a public joke, a cautionary tale of cold feet turned national scandal. At one point, she attempted to profit off her notoriety, filing for trademarks on the phrase Runaway Bride for potential merchandising deals. But public backlash was swift and the idea quickly fizzled. As the years passed, she faded further into obscurity. She kept a low profile, moved away from Duluth, and avoided any further public attention. But the internet never forgets. Even today, a simple search for her name brings up the same story, the tale of a woman who faked her own kidnapping to escape a wedding she couldn't face. Jennifer Wilbanks may have disappeared from public view, but her story, it remains one of the most infamous runaway bride cases in history. Even now, nearly 2 decades later, Jennifer Wilbanks' case still leaves lingering questions. What was she really thinking when she planned her escape? Was she truly overwhelmed with fear, so consumed by anxiety that she saw no other way out? Or was it something else, a carefully calculated act, a dramatic ploy to avoid confrontation? And then there's the most unsettling thought of all. If she had never called 911, if she had never broken down and confessed, would we have ever discovered the truth? Would she have come home on her own, or would she have simply started over, leaving everyone behind to grieve a disappearance that was never real? Maybe Jennifer Wilbanks didn't just run from her wedding. Maybe she ran from the life she never really wanted. And the only person who knows the real answer is Jennifer herself.